and welcome.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes, I can.
All right. Yeah, well, thanks, Ellen, for that introduction. I think I might skip some slides because of that. But yeah, so as she mentioned, I'm Yoshi Jimenez. Can probably go here. And so I'm currently an associate and project manager at Architects Fora, which is an all-women-led virtual architecture practice. So I get to work from home. I have, as Ellen mentioned, almost 9 years of experience now. Um, Affordable housing is my biggest passion when it comes to architecture. So that has been my focus for most of my career so far. Um, but yeah, have definitely started to get more involved in the community engagement aspect of practice. Um, so just gonna kind of share a little bit more about my story and how I ended up in architecture. So here's a picture of my family. I have three siblings, so one sister, two brothers, and obviously my parents. And um, the two kiddos are our first niece and nephew. So definitely welcome the addition to our family. Um, yeah, so as mentioned previously, I was born in Mexico City. Um, my parents are indigenous to the state of Oaxaca, so the Mixtec region. There's a prominent community of Mixtecos in Santa Maria, so definitely feels like home. um, so yeah, I was around 4 when we immigrated to the US, and I don't know the reason, but around age 9, I decided I wanted to be an architect. Apparently, I was 100% sure that that's what I was going to be. And from that point on, my focus was like, okay, do good in school, get to college, do architecture. I don't think I had an actual realistic concept of what it was going to take, but that was my goal. Unfortunately, right before high school graduation, I was diagnosed with a rare neuromuscular disease. So that kind of really threw off a lot of my plans. Um, so that really led to my extended stint at Hancock from 2003 to 2010. I think I decided to go to Hancock also because of my sort of like developing condition, and all my doctors were here. It made sense to just stay local. And they do have an architecture program, so um, started to take courses there. But I mean, for anyone familiar with 2003, we were still drafting by hand. CAD was not that big of a thing yet. So um, as my condition progressed, any sort of like physical activity became really, really hard. So I actually struggled to draft and do anything related to sketching or the type of work we were doing at the time. So I kind of took a detour, started to explore other potential career options in case I didn't get sort of like my mobility back. So it stayed a while at Hancock, trying to navigate that whole situation. Um, I ended up having a thymectomy, so that's when they remove your thymus gland right behind your breastbone. They don't know why, but it's somehow related to that particular condition. And I was able to go into remission a few months after, and I just kind of little by little started to regain a lot of my physical strength. And I had explored a lot of stuff, but nothing seemed to really fulfill what architecture fulfilled for me. I think just so I ended up kind of going back and continued to to get on track with the architecture courses, and was able to transfer to Cal Poly in 2010. Um, I was there, had to deal with some of the uh, remaining side effects of having been very inactive for quite a few years. physically, and Cal Poly, those of you who know it, it's very hilly, very tough for someone with mobility issues. But fortunately, I was able to graduate in 2014, and I actually got my first job in Santa Barbara with Paul Poirier and Associates. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with him. So yeah, obviously a lot of smaller commercial projects working there. I was commuting from Santa Maria down to Santa Barbara. So it was definitely a long commute. And it was, I think my focus even in school was affordable housing. And obviously working with Paul, that was not one of our primary focuses. So eventually I ended up seeing an opportunity to work at the San Luis Obispo office of RRM Design Group, which would cut my commute time in like half. So I gave it a shot and ended up getting hired at RRM and was there from 2016 to last year, 2022. That's where I kind of really developed my focus and sort of like experience and expertise in affordable multifamily projects. I was also during my time at RRM that I started to work with their planning group on community outreach projects. So being bilingual and obviously being part of sort of like a large minority group that's often underrepresented in any sort of like planning efforts put on by cities and whatnot. Kind of, I gravitated towards that. At the time I realized like how little I knew about planning and like community engagement and all that. So I definitely continued to work with the planning group whenever there was an opportunity to kind of be that sort of like connecting person between the community they were trying to outreach to and whatever the project was. So kind of that was my first really intro to community engagement. And I always wonder like, why don't we do this for architecture? And like there's so much good feedback that people are able to provide just from like their lived experiences. So I saw last year, I saw there was an opportunity to work with Architects Fora, and I knew that that was something that they were getting into, like the community engagement and how to really bring that into the design process. So I gave it another shot, and I was very fortunate to get hired. And that's currently where I'm working. Yeah, and earlier this year, so from March through May, I was also selected to be part of the Argentina cohort number 5. So that's Argentina is a professional leadership and licensure initiative, really trying to raise that 1% of Latinas and licensed Latinas in architecture. And I got to meet some people from the Santa Barbara and Ventura area, so other local Central Coast Latinas that are practicing. So that wrapped up last month. Did I miss? I think I might have missed my slide. Oh, this one. And then, yeah, a couple of weeks ago, my siblings and I were able to hand out our first 2 scholarships to Allan Hancock students. So that was an initiative we started late last year where we recognized just how valuable our time at Hancock had been for all of us. We're all alumni from Hancock in some sense. So we did that, got to do that, sort of like pay it forward in a sense to other community students. And so this fall, I'll be starting my first teaching job there. I'll be teaching the digital tools and architecture course for students, kind of introducing them to Photoshop and design, SketchUp programs like that. So that's kind of where I'm at currently. We're going into some work samples. So this was one of the first affordable housing projects that I got to work on while at RM, the Courtyard at Terra Meadows. So it's a family, large family affordable housing project set up like on a hilly site that was tough to construct on, but the views from these apartments are like, people wouldn't think that these are affordable apartments, but they are. Um, so this really kind of led me to like continue in this path. And the Halcyon Collective, this project is in Arroyo Grande, another family affordable housing project. Um, both of these with the Housing Authority of San Luis Obispo. Um, so yeah, I just kind of got into it. And every project would really help kind of step up my game when it came to understanding the requirements of affordable housing, and the TCAC and all that stuff. So yeah, this one is a project that I'm currently working on at Architects Fora. It's a support center for an existing multifamily community by City Team, which is like um, a religious organization, but they have like a nonprofit sector that uh, really tries to help people struggling with homelessness and substance abuse, that kind of stuff. And they bought these existing apartment properties, and they're planning on like updating them. They use these as rapid rehousing units to help women experiencing domestic violence. So whenever they need to get out of a difficult situation, they're able to like take them in. It's a rent-free, really try to support women and children that find themselves in this situation. So it's a really cool project. It's been um, a lot of our team members are super excited to be part of like helping this community out. So this one's still in that permitting phase. Um, this was the first project I got to help out with on when I joined Fora. Currently still working out the funding sources. As we know, affordable housing can be challenging when it comes to that, but yeah, super excited to get to work on like a different scale of a project, different approaches, and different or like detailing, uh, a different level of detailing that we don't typically see around the Central Coast. So definitely one of the benefits of working for a remote practice that has projects in other parts of the state. So this one is in Sunnyvale, I believe, if I remember correctly. So definitely our projects focus primarily on like the South Bay, up in the Bay Area. So yeah, going back to the community engagement component. So in practice, we saw just how much our developers valued the community engagement work that we were doing, that we ended up really putting a lot of effort into developing it into a separate branch of our practice, where we don't only do community engagement for our projects, but have been recently been pairing up with or partnering up with other architects, where we help lead the community engagement component of their design process. Um, and it's been great getting out into the community, meeting with people, and we've definitely noticed just how valuable it is to get people's feedback. And we're always learning. It's a constant learning opportunity for everyone involved. Um, so that's what Engage Fora is now, a branch of our practice. Um, but beyond architecture, I think community engagement can relate to a lot of different areas of our lives, whether it's professional or just personal. So I'm definitely kind of, as introverted as I am, I have found ways to really engage with my community in different roles. So as was mentioned previously, I am the Associates Director for the Central Coast chapter up in San Luis Obispo. One of our biggest focuses these past couple of years is just providing associates an opportunity to get together and focus on their licensure process. And we have had a couple people really to start passing their exams, and it's been they credit having this opportunity of having people that are going along through the same process with them and kind of relying on each other. So I'm excited to continue seeing that develop into us having more licensed associates in the near future. I also started what we call the Women in Architecture, Engineering, and Construction group up in the San Luis Obispo area. I think it started as a smaller, just internal group while I was at RRM, but as some of us started leaving, we still wanted to meet up. We kind of missed that opportunity to just get together with other women in the profession. And we just kind of started to expand it. Right now it's over 20 people in the group. And we just have gatherings every couple months and just talk about anything, but we always find ourselves talking about architecture. And I guess that's what happens when you put a lot of architects in the same space, in the same room. But yeah, it's been great to see it grow and evolve, and just getting an opportunity to talk and interact with people in the adjacent professions, I think has also been really fun and enlightening for many of us. And as I mentioned, I have been getting more involved with our local AIAS chapter at Hancock, doing some presentations on portfolios and that kind of stuff. I think the more I interacted with them, the more I realized just how little info is out there for them and very few resources. Obviously our community doesn't have as big of an architecture industry as maybe San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara, and we find ourselves right in the middle of resources, but that feel a little bit too far away from access to the students here. So definitely started to get more involved there, and that's part of what led to my soon to be teaching opportunity at Allan Hancock. Yeah, so here's my contact info in case anyone is interested in connecting. You can follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can always email me at yoshijimenez@gmail.com. But yeah, I'm open to questions, comments.
Thank you, Yoshi. Wow. So you've done so much. It's amazing. And had so many challenges you had to kind of overcome along the way too.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really remarkable. Yeah, I'd love to hear questions from anyone in the group, and maybe I'll just get started by offering one myself, and just more about the role you see in that community engagement in what effects you've seen specifically on different projects you're working on, like that input that you're getting from the community. What does that typically result in?
Mm-hmm. So definitely, having now been doing community engagement and a couple different communities, there's definitely a difference between doing community engagement in Palo Alto versus Salinas. Different. So obviously really taking into account who the community or what the community makeup is like. I think you start to realize that what works in one place doesn't always work in another, especially with very diverse or different populations. It's also like a constant learning experience. So I think that's the biggest thing about community engagement, is that as much as we try to come up with processes and sort of template presentations, as soon as you start talking to the people, you start to get a better idea of things that are going to work or not work for them. So especially in areas with people that aren't as familiar with just the profession in general and the process of building and developing, we've definitely noticed that graphics are such an important part of how we present information, because we can get into all the jargon and all that stuff, and it makes sense to us, but it doesn't always translate the same for people, like people just in the general community. So we've definitely been focusing on creating a lot more graphic content to represent different topics and ideas. So it's always kind of like this loop of like, we try something, but we get feedback and we adjust it and try to present that, and probably going to get more feedback. So it's just this constant evolving process for us. But yeah, it's something that I think we had a presentation, I think a couple weeks ago for Housing Month up in the Bay Area. I can share the link with you all later. Talking about how it can impact the entitlement process. So we do a case study of one of the projects that took advantage of sort of like the streamlining legislation that is currently in effect in our state, along with a robust community engagement component to get an affordable housing project entitled in like 3 months. So that's how one of the ways it translates into sort of like faster approvals in general for these type of projects, is just being very intentional about how you're engaging with the community and trying to respond to as many of your community's like questions or concerns. But yeah, we're still learning, so there's definitely a lot of things that we're keeping track of, and really trying to figure out how to I guess fine tune as we continue to do this. But in general, I think we've seen it just be a positive thing. Yeah, I'll definitely share that link. We have it on our
Yeah, that would be
website.
great.
Yeah. We have a couple handouts, and we've set it up in our website to be just a free resource for anyone interested in learning more about community engagement.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I don't know your first name, but your hand is up.
No.
Do you tell us your first name? Oops.
Oh, I think she froze. Right?
Yeah. Uh-oh. Maybe turn off your camera if your internet isn't working also well. We can come back. Does someone else have a question for Yoshi? Oh, Isabel.
Yeah, I do. Oh, go ahead, Isabel.
Oh, you're muted. There's
Hi.
Yeah, there you are.
Hi, Yoshi. I want to congratulate you with the amazing presentation that you have done today. It is really helpful when you see the timeline to track your experience. And I wouldn't say that you are an introvert at all. It's pretty great. Everything that you are doing and engaging and creating community with other women in the Central Coast is really great. So my question to you is that I really applaud your tenacity and your sorry, how do you say resilience? How resilient you are, sorry. And how did you push through the hard moments to keep going and getting your dream coming to fruition, right? It's just really impressive. And I guess that is also a push for the daily work. So I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, it was definitely a challenging period in my life, but I think out of it just came this, I think because of my condition and knowing that stress really had an impact on sort of like making symptoms worse and that kind of stuff, that I really learned to like let a lot of things go. Really focus on like your health should be your main priority always. Without it, everything becomes so much harder. But with it, you can overcome basically any other obstacle. Health is just one of those things that you often have very little control over. But I think that just as I went through Cal Poly, I'm like, I'm not gonna stress out. I'm learning what I'm learning. I'm not aiming for like straight A's, anything. It's like all about learning. And as long as I know I'm learning and that I'm making progress, I'm not gonna like put extra pressure on myself to like do like be perfect or whatever. And I think that just got me into this mindset of really being able to not stress about a lot of things, which I think has, as I got into practice, it definitely became a good approach to practice, because it can be very stressful at times. But I think having gone through all that stuff, things to me now, it's like they don't have as much sort of like a stress factors as maybe someone who hasn't had to experience something like that could be a bit like one of their biggest challenges. For me, it's like I almost always use it to compare it to that time period, and everything seems to be less stressful than that. And so it really puts me in that mindset of like, hey, we can get through this. Like this is like nothing compared to what I've had to deal with before. And I think it's also because my particular condition doesn't have a cure. I am technically just in remission. It could come back, and it's really hard to tell what would trigger it back, or when it might decide to come, like show up again. I think it's one of the reasons I just kind of continue to try to push forward, and why maybe I sometimes sign up to do a lot more than I probably should be doing at the same time, because I'm so I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm always like, okay, how much can I get done before maybe it comes back again? So I mean, I've been very fortunate that what is this? Yeah, 2023, probably 17 years in remission now. But it's almost like the longer it goes, the more I feel like it's going to come back, because that is typical of this particular condition, that it doesn't always result in like lifetime remission or whatever. So I don't know. I think part of me just tries to ignore it and focus on, okay, how much can I do? And that's probably another reason why I focus so much on things that I feel might have a lot of impact, like engaging with students and helping provide scholarships for them, and this kind of like things that I feel could be very impactful, and require not that much time, other than me taking the time out of my weekend or half of my day to do and engage with students. I think that's obviously I spend a lot of time at Hancock because of my conditions. I think I kind of remember still very vividly all the professors and all the support I had there. And part of me is always like, okay, I understand what a lot of students have to go through. So how can I help them or help make it easier for them? So I think definitely what I went through has impacted a lot of my choices and just my focus. I think sometimes I forget. So it's like great that you asked that question. It's making me try to like reflect on that, and hopefully this answers your question. But I would probably
Oh
need
my
a
God.
bit more time
Yes.
to really.
No, I think that's amazing. And I want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge and pushing other people. You know, that's always so amazing, having other fellas that tells you that you are there for them, and that makes a huge impact. And thank you for doing that. I really love that. And keep going, and don't think about nothing is gonna happen. Okay,
Right.
just like mindset. Okay, thank you so much.
No,
Appreciate that.
thank you for your question, Isa.
Okay, looks like you're back, so please ask your question.
I'll try. Thank you. Sorry, cut out. Thank you so much, Yoshi. I actually started working at RM a year ago, and my coworkers have said great things about you. So it's nice to put a face to the name and the reputation. I'm curious if you would like to share more about your adventure into teaching. Seems really exciting, and if you knew you always wanted to teach and how the opportunity came along.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one. I think architecture, like I said, was a decision made a long time ago. But especially as I got older and got to see, teaching was one of those things that I always found interesting, but also didn't think would be something that I'd be able to do just because of how um, quiet. I feel like I'm really quiet right now. It probably doesn't come across that way, but I am. And public speaking is not my forte. So I think that was always one of those things that made me hesitate to even consider teaching. Um, then when I got sick and I couldn't speak, that was one of the sort of like the symptoms is just being unable to speak. I'm like, well, obviously that's not an option. That's all teachers do. They talk to students. Like, that's one of their biggest tools to communicate with them. So I think it just kind of left my mind after that. It was like, this isn't something that I can do. It wasn't until I think I really got into practice, and I feel like I always gravitated towards being sort of like that mentor to like the new employees and really trying to help them and like teach them like whatever it was that we were focusing on. And people really responded, and they would mention like, oh, you're really good at that, like at like teaching others and like mentoring and that kind of stuff. But I don't think it was like a conscious thing that I was doing. It was just like, okay, this is just what I do and this is how I do it. And that was one of the reasons I started getting involved in like other things related to youth. I did the Santa Maria leadership program through the Chamber of Commerce, and that really put me in touch with a lot of like the community organizations and the different things that were happening, and the fact that at least northern Santa Barbara County struggles with sort of like reading, what did they call it? Sort of like the reading level that students should be at. They're really behind, and I think that just kind of like brought me back to like, oh yeah, like these students, like we should be supporting them, and started getting engaged, like touch base with one of my former professors at Hancock, saying like, hey, is there anything like I can do with the architecture students? Little by little, I think eventually he asked me to join his their technical advisory committee that they have for the architecture department at Hancock, where they hope to hear from especially like industry professionals that kind of see what's going on to kind of help guide them through like the development of their courses, making sure that they're prepping the students for jobs in the current market. So that's how I got in touch with them, and then started to get more involved with the AIAS club there, and starting to do more presentations. Just talking to them, I just started to realize like, hey, they can probably use a lot more support in these areas. And that's how I put together a presentation for them on like their portfolio. I think they're just weren't as familiar with why you need one and how to put one together and what to include. So I'm like, okay, we have to go back to the basics here. So I did that, and I think they were really impressed and surprised by the content and the level of information I was able to provide. And they're like, hey, would you be interested in teaching? And I was like, sure. What do I have to do? And especially because my focus is more like on the tools, I think it seemed like a good fit. And I'm like, okay, I'll give this a shot. And I have another coworker who is currently teaching at Cal Poly too. So I think just being in a virtual practice, we have that flexibility too, that really lends itself for us to do this sort of thing. And just seeing her sort of like blossom into, she's like, I didn't know teaching was a passion of mine, but now it is. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's the feeling I'm gonna have once I start doing this. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think really influences our approach to work as well. And I think that's probably one of the reasons we've even decided to do it. It's just how we can take what we're doing in work and help us share that with students, but also taking what sort of like the new ideas and things that the younger students are like coming up with, and like bring that back into our work, and like, oh, we should consider this, or like, this is what we're hearing from younger people. Again, it's just, I think those two professions seem to lend themselves very well to kind of like co-happening at the same time. But yeah, I'm excited to see how that turns out. But yeah, it was like a very organic way of how I got into it. It wasn't anything like planned or very structured. It was just like, this led to this and this led to that, and like, these connections happened. And yeah, I just kind of let myself take advantage of those opportunities and see where they lead. And yeah, that's how how I ended up with that opportunity.
Yeah. Great way to just kind of grow into things over time and
Mhm.
see where you can make a difference and what fits in with the rest of your life.
Mhm.
I love that.
Yeah.
Great. Other questions or thoughts? Oh yeah, Sam. Hi, you're muted. There you go.
One day you'll also need to teach me how to raise my hand digitally. I do have a question, and it sounds like you followed your heart, which I really admire in this process of everything. And what you've done in that process is very impactful. Even just being in this conversation right now with you, I'm very impressed how you continue to add value to people's lives in the work that you do. And so I'm very new to the conversation of affordable housing and planning and permitting in Santa Barbara, but being a little bit of an outlier, as I lived in Chicago for 15 years and recognizing that there's a need for housing here, I'm just wondering, in the process of community engagement, to back up, because I don't know how even, I don't even know if is there affordable housing here? Do we have affordable? Right.
Yeah.
It's like, I see it happening even in the building that I live in the neighborhood around me, where buildings are being sold and developers are putting in boutique hotels. And I'm like, where is everybody going? And there's a particular, income bracket of people that it's becoming unaffordable to live here, which is why the freeways are expanding. So commuters come to Ventura and whatnot.
Yeah.
But anyway, hone that back in, because it's a much larger conversation.
Yeah.
Just the community engagement is so interesting to me in the planning process. How is the audience chosen? How do you bring people in from the community to be part of that process? I guess was my first question.
Different. I think it's a great timing for your question, as we're kind of currently doing that for one of our community engagement projects. And we start with what we call stakeholder interviews. So typically at the start of one of these projects, you have, whether it's the client or people in the city that already kind of have more or less a list of people that they think, okay, you should be reaching out to these people. And then what we do is what we call sort of like snowball interviews, where at the end of our interview with one of these initial stakeholders, we ask them, like, who else should we be reaching out to? And like that list of who we should be talking to can grow really quickly. Obviously, you want to keep in mind how many of these interviews or focus group meetings you budget it for, but for the most part, you get really good input from those community members as to who you should be talking to. And often it's a lot of the local community organizations that have those like sort of like direct contact to the population that you're trying to serve. So for example, like in the project that we're working on for Salinas, we started with a lot of the contacts from the list that was provided to us by the city. And they obviously have ties to other organizations. So we started with a couple of them, and they're like, oh, make sure to reach out to so-and-so. And you want to make sure to reach out to so-and-so, because they know their community. They know who has like reach to what population. And they're like, hey, if you're focusing on, hey, this is affordable housing for low-income families with maybe half of the unit set aside for farm workers. You obviously want to connect with those people that have that sort of like direct access to the farm worker community or the low-income community. And they start to pop up, and they're like, oh, and don't forget to reach out to these people, because these people don't speak Spanish or don't speak English, and they don't do this. Like, make sure you hire translators, and these are some contacts for that. And like the community itself starts to provide a lot of that info, but it starts with those are like that initial list provided by someone close to the project, whether it's on the city side or the developer side. But yeah, and then it just grows. And obviously we go from that stakeholder phase to, okay, we have now a good idea of like, hey, if you want to reach out to like actual community members, these events are happening. And that's the other thing. Sometimes you have to weigh whether you want to set something up where you're expecting people to come, but that might not always work for the community you're doing engagement in. Well, in Salinas in particular, they're like, hey, you're asking a lot of people to take time out of their day. This is a very like hardworking community, working 6 days a week, whatever little time they have. I don't know if they'd be really into coming to provide some feedback for this project that won't happen for like 6 years or whatever, because it takes a long time to build affordable housing. So they're like, instead of that approach, try going to them. Go put up a pop-up tent at one of the events that are already happening, whether it's just Saturdays at the park that are full of like soccer players and families, or outside of churches on Sunday, or like whatever that particular community sort of like does, and what tends to bring them together, and going to them can be an approach that works for that particular community. So it's always kind of gauging that based on the interviews you have with your initial stakeholders. And I think how you put together your questions to try to get that info from them is also very important. What are you looking for from them? Making sure your questions tap into that so that you get the info that you're looking for. But yeah, that's usually how we start. It's just talking to the locals. And that's why I think it obviously, for our practice being virtual and a lot of us not living in those particular communities, is another great way to really learn about the community from the people from that community. Because even, I think it's one of the things that I noticed, as I mentioned before, doing that leadership program, you can live in a community and still be very unaware of like your community. Like you're within your bubble, and that's how you experience your community. And it's not until like you put yourself in a position where you get to experience these other aspects that you actually start to learn about it. So I think it's just part of our process that which we started because we are a virtual practice to do community engagement, and we just saw how valuable it was. And obviously it's grown and been developed even further. But yeah, I think it'd be great to see this become a thing that's just part of our design practice, of our design process.
Agreed. I think it's immensely important. I was just reading an article on the community housing in Vienna. I don't know if anyone's from, and how they nailed it. Like, and to see the places that were, you know, and once you're into their community housing, you're in for life. It doesn't matter if your income changes, the affordable housing. But much like what's the support for Grace Village Support Center that's being created, it just was so beautiful to see the environments that they made that were incorporated everyone's needs in the community, or brought the community, I guess, even more together through play areas, or, you know, pool tables, or rooftop gardens, or it's a really, it's a beautiful thing. And I think it increases then community engagement and starts to dissolve those walls of separation that unfortunately are still prevalent today in many instances. So thank you for all the work that you're doing around that. It's amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your question. And
Michelle, you look like you have a question. You're muted.
See if I can get
There you
myself
are.
unmuted. Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, I just so inspired by your perseverance and really appreciate you presenting today. And really admire your commitment to community. That is fantastic. The housing need in our state is you know, as we all know, very, very impacted. So I'm so happy to hear that there are groups out there doing this work that you're doing. So thank you for that. It's kind of funny you mentioned, you know, knew you wanted to be an architect at 9. I knew I wanted to be in the architecture industry in 3rd grade. And so sometimes it just happens, you just know. So that's very, very cool. I can totally relate to that. And I would love to hear more about the Women in Construction, Architecture and Engineering group that you're in, because I'm in San Luis, and I was not aware of the meetings. I'd love to participate.
Oh no, awesome. Nice to hear that, or meet someone new in San Luis Obispo. Yeah, so like I mentioned, I think it started as just this internal thing. While we were at RRM, I think most of us were sort of like in that junior position. We didn't really have any senior women mentors or leaders in our particular department. So we just started kind of doing like lunches and be like, hey, do you guys want to come? And obviously it's an opportunity, like, hey, I'm like dealing with this on this project, and people can share like, oh, well, this is an approach I took to something similar. We just started to see just the benefit of being around and feeling comfortable around the people you were with, in this case, other women, to really help you through whatever thing you're going through, whether it's work related or not. And some of us, obviously, we left RM, but the group was still like, oh, we should still plan to meet outside. And then it kind of went from just kind of taking the group from within sort of like the RM umbrella and just pulling it out and it started kind of with this sort of like the same group of women meeting up. And then we're like, well, now we can't just say that it's an RRM thing, because we're not at RRM anymore. And we're like, oh, well, maybe we should invite some other people that we know were also former RRMers. And that's how we started to include some, like one of our former interior designers. And then maybe let's reach out. Obviously, RRM, being a multidisciplinary firm, had women in other departments like structural and like civil and we're like, yeah, why are we keeping it to just architecture? I think a lot of women in male dominated fields are probably going through similar things. So let's just make it broader. And little by little, it's more like, oh, I met this person and I told them about the group, and that's how the group started to grow. It's like we just meet people and then we're like, hey, you want to join our group? It's very organic. It's not like super formalized. So it's usually like, hey, do a couple of us have time to plan something? It's like, oh, let's do a meetup in a couple of weeks. Who can show up? It's hard, obviously, to try to wrangle a large group of people, but for the most part, we do get at least, like you mentioned, like half of the people turning up. Again, we're from different areas. We have people in Paso, San Luis Obispo. I'm down in Santa Maria. So it's definitely a struggle sometimes to try to find a location that works for everyone. So we're like, okay, one time we'll do it further south and sometimes we'll do it further north, but it just very organically grew from people, just meeting people. So now that I know you're in San Luis Obispo, I'm like, hey, I met Michelle.
Yes, I'll email you after the presentation. You can see
No,
my
totally.
info.
Yeah. And I can share we created a Slack group because we're all like doing different things, but at least we can always go back to that Slack group and use it as a way to communicate and organize. But yeah, it's very, very, very chill.
Nice.
But yeah, well, there's nothing similar going up in San Luis Obispo County, I think. It's one of the things that I always knew Santa Barbara had. I'm like, you guys actually have committees and like you guys are doing this stuff. We don't have that level of sort of like organization, especially like in our chapter. So it would probably take a while to put something official together. But I'm like, hey, at least we know there's interest based on this sort of like interest group that's organically growing. But yeah, I can definitely share, and hopefully, I think we're trying to do a happy hour in a couple weeks.
That's great.
And see if it works out to get to meet you in person.
That'd be
Well,
awesome.
as organized as this Santa Barbara chapter tries to be, we've really not done a great job of serving our whole area that, it's supposed to be the chapter for the whole county of Santa Barbara. So Yoshi, having you join us today is, part of us trying to do better, but it's just been so sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I first joined the AIA, I think back in 2018, 19, I forget, I was initially part of the Santa Barbara chapter, because I live in Santa Maria. It is that county. But like you mentioned, I saw very little sort of like outreach of beyond the city of Santa Barbara. And I'm like, whether it was the content or just the events, and I'm like, I'm too far out. Like none of the stuff going on in this chapter are really impacting me. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't know if it makes sense. So then I kind of let my membership lapse. And part of me is like, I really didn't see as much of a benefit in being part of AIA in general. And then I was talking to someone, I think in the slow chapter, and it was kind of the same thing, because I'm like, you guys are very city of San Luis Obispo focused. And it's called Central Coast, but I see most of the activities and everything being set up in San Luis Obispo. And again, I just struggle to see how the lack of reach and activities beyond those two particular cities would be beneficial to me. And then someone pointed out, well, maybe if you join, you could change that. And I'm like, oh man, that's a great point. And that's really how I think
that is how they get you.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. And then one of my coworkers who was the associates director before me, she's like, you're really good at organizing people, and like people like come together when you tell them to. And I'm like, do they? She's like, I'm trying to like step down from this position, and I think you'd be a great person to kind of take over it. And I'm like, I don't know. I really had to think about it. But yeah, that comment that person made is like, well, if you see that there's not a lot of things happening beyond those cities, like maybe this is an opportunity for you to help change that. And I think that's how I kind of help establish that relationship between the Hancock student chapter and our chapter. More so because of the proximity. I think it would be great if the Santa Barbara chapter would also kind of reach out to that to those students and at Hancock. But the distance itself is just like, those are some of the things where it's like students sometimes don't always own cars. They use public transportation, or they are working and going to school, and these things just distance plays such a big role in determining what we're able to do. And that's how I brought it up to our board. And I'm like, hey, I know that technically they belong to the other chapter and fall under their sort of like area of influence, but proximity wise, I see them coming up to Poly Canyon village, and I see them doing construction tours up in like AG. So they're obviously more involved with Slow County just because of our proximity
Mhm.
versus the rest of Santa Barbara County. But yeah, we're in a very interesting position where we belong to
Yeah.
one group, but we're closer to the
Mhm.
other. But in general, I'm like, this should be a regional thing. Like we're so close, and a lot of the things that happen in one county impact the other, that I think we
Right.
should be thinking about it more in a regional sense.
That's a really good point. I mean, it makes me think that like if we joined forces with, say, the San Luis Obispo group and came up with ideas for programming and stuff, that you guys would be perfect, like as the location for, people
Mhm.
coming from two different directions to
Yeah,
meet up in the middle.
exactly. We
Yeah,
could
and the
try,
other, yeah,
we could try an informal women in architecture meetup,
yeah.
like in the center.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone that's ever been to Presqu'île Winery, if you haven't, I
Mhm.
highly recommend it. One of our favorite spots.
Okay.
There's wine involved and really good
That's
food.
always a
So
good thing.
yeah, we can make it happen.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, so sorry. Any last minute questions from the group as we wrap up? And one last question I had, Yoshi, was just regarding kind of what we're just talking about, sort of the virtual factor in people getting together, and just how interesting it is that Architect Fora is based on that. And I was just curious, did that start before COVID, or was that a byproduct of where things were at that point, and how far distributed are the people within the firm?
No, that's a great question. So it's almost like a half and half. So Architects Fora is basically the result of the merging of a fully virtual practice that was owned by our principal, basically, one of our principals, and then a very sort of like traditional brick and mortar practice. So during COVID, sort of like the OJKs, or like the office, like standard traditional practice, needed help transitioning to having their employees working from home, and they weren't set up for that to be something that they can easily do. So they kind of hired the virtual practice as sort of like consultants to help them migrate their systems and do like all this so that their employees could work from home. And eventually they started kind of like collaborating on one of the projects, and they really liked how they were working together. And at the same time, I think the principal of the traditional practice started thinking about retiring and offered to kind of sell his practice to these, like one of his current principals, along with the principal from the um, virtual practice. And they got in touch with one of their friends, and they just kind of came together and thought about it, and they're like, okay, let's do it. And they like went for it. They bought the practice, they rebranded to Architects Fora and made it fully virtual. So they got rid of their leases, they got rid of all their office space, all the sort of like traditional architecture practice stuff and processes, and basically took on the business model of the one that already had her own remote practice already kind of going, and kind of based it off of that. And that's how they basically transitioned to Architects Fora. And right now we have a team member in, I think, Arizona, Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, South Carolina, New York, and then there's a couple of us here in California with I don't know, Michelle, if you know Jessica Goswick. She's in San Luis Obispo. I'm down here in Santa Maria, so we're kind of like the two Central Coast people. She was also a former RRM, so that's where we met, and it's been fun getting to work with her again. But yeah, we're kind of like all over the place. We do have our annual retreats that so far we've been hosting them in the Bay Area because that's where most of our construction projects are going on. So it's always a good opportunity for people, especially those further out, to come and check out the construction going on for some of our projects. So we still plan to have those like in-person meetups. But I think just the way we've set up, really being very intentional on and making sure that we are forming those personal connections with each other, I think has been key, and making sure that our team doesn't feel like we're missing out on not being around each other in person. Yeah.
Amazing. That's great. Yoshi, thank you so much. So many interesting things, you know, about your journey and then the firm that you're working with. And thank you so much for sharing all of that with us today.
No, thank you for inviting me. Hopefully we'll get to see each other in a larger group gathering again.
Well, you got my wheels turning about how we can connect some more dots than we've managed to do so far. So I'm very excited about that. I'll follow up with you on some ideas.
All right. Yeah.
Thank
Nice
you.
meeting
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
you
Nice
so
to meet you.
much.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Bye.
Yoshi. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Yoshi.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.